And most of the time in photography, your subject wants to be photographed. But in wildlife photography, your subject may actually attack you. So today we're going to talk to wildlife photographer Jake Davis and get tips and tricks and hear all about wildlife photography. Let's do it. All right, hello, welcome to this video on Photography TV. Today we have a wildlife photographer, Jake Davis. You can find him on Instagram, his website, both are called Revealed in Nature, as you see below. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. It's a pleasure.
All right, I am excited to have you on the show. So I start every interview, I say every photographer has a story. Start us off, tell us your story.
Well, my journey in photography goes back since probably at the age of 5 or 6. When I was a kid, my family would take a trip from Kentucky to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which is where I live now.
Okay.
And we come out every summer and spend 2 or 3 months out here.
Wow.
And so I got hooked on it on a really, at a really early age. And part of that trip was my mom would buy me and my brother both a disposable camera. And kind of the idea was you have that camera for the whole trip and you make it last. And my brother didn't really have an issue with that. I mean, he could have made one last for 2 or 3 months. I, on the other hand, I actually never even made it to Jackson with the camera.
Wow.
We would stop on the second day in Nebraska, and we would go to Cabela's.
Yeah.
If you've been in the headquarters.
Oh, I live right by one. Not in that one, but I live by one.
Okay. Well, if you go all the way to the back, there's this 2-story wall, and it's all mounted wildlife. And so my dad would go back in the bargain cave and look for deals on shirts. My brother would look at fishing equipment. We were just stocking up on stuff for that summer. And I would spend that 2 hours just photographing the diversity of wildlife in Cabela's. And as a young, aspiring wildlife photographer, it's hard to imagine a better opportunity to work on skills. And so I would spend hours just trying to isolate one animal, because if you have like a polar bear and a zebra in the same scene, it kind of gives it away. And I was trying to make it as realistic as possible.
Okay.
So I blew through a whole roll of film before we ever got to Jackson, and we'd have to go to Kmart right away right when we got there. So I think it became clear to me, and especially my parents at an early age, that photography was a passion and something I would end up pursuing. So
that's fantastic. All right, keep us going that journey. I love the story of going out to Jackson as a kid. How did that evolve into becoming a profession for you?
Well, it was a long process.
Okay.
It went from disposable cameras to a little Canon Rebel, T2000 film camera. But it just, we came out every summer, so I had a lot of opportunities to spend time with wildlife. And as I got older, I started to take it a little bit more seriously. I think, ended up building a website when I was in high school. But there was a point at which you kind of made that big step to saying, okay, I'm actually going to pursue this professionally.
Yep.
When I was a kid, I thought it would be fun, but it also seemed like it would be difficult to pull off.
Yes.
And so as I got into my early 20s, I thought, well, if there is an opportunity to go for it, this is probably it. So I'm going to give it a shot. And here I am, still in Jackson Hole.
That's awesome. What was that pivotal moment, or what were some of those things that helped you get going and know that, hey, this is something you can make a profession of it?
Well, I started doing a little bit with retail. I have a greeting card line now, but I started off very small, and just getting a lot of positive feedback, honestly, from people buying prints, retail stores carrying the product, and I thought, hey, maybe I can really make a go at this. I had some very helpful conversations with some other successful photographers at the time. Awesome. Who kind of encouraged me. It was a mixed bag, though. A lot of advice I got was the opposite. It was, you should see if you can make a living any other way other than photography, because it's a very difficult industry. And I decided, well, I'll give it a shot, and so far it's worked out. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. I love people's stories. You mentioned greeting cards. Obviously, wildlife photography is a big part of your business. Talk us through just how your business is set up. What percentage of it is wildlife? What percentage of it is other stuff? Just talk us through, just in general, your business approach.
I would say my business is, we could just divide all of my photography into probably 3 categories.
Okay.
So one would be retail, and that's now I have a greeting card line. So I work with retail stores. The second, and I do print sales too, but I honestly don't push that a whole lot. That's more just private sales.
Okay.
That's not, I wouldn't say that's a staple of my business at this point.
Okay.
The retail is, and then secondly, it's teaching. So I do photography workshops.
Yes.
I teach out in the Tetons and Yellowstone. We see awesome stuff. We photograph wildlife. We learn techniques. We do post-process. It's kind of like the whole shebang in one day. So
Awesome.
Teaching was something I decided to kind of focus on early on, as I was thinking, okay, if I'm going to go at this, what's the quickest way to get a revenue stream going?
Yep.
And as you well know, at one point, there were a lot of people who were making a great living selling stock photography and selling prints. That era has kind of died out. Not that people don't make a living doing that now, but certainly not as many do.
Sure.
And so what I realized as I jumped into this professionally was that the same factor that kind of caused that downward spiral in those other two industries had also opened up a whole new front for making a profit. And that's now that photography is more accessible for people
Yes.
that are getting into it, which is an awesome thing. And a lot of people would frankly rather pay you to take them out and enable them to take an incredible photo they can hang on their wall instead of putting your print on the wall. And I have to resist that, but to go ahead and roll with it. And it's been a lot of fun, and I love teaching. It's a very rewarding thing to do. So that's the second under my 3 categories. And then the third is not so much profitable as much as it is just personally rewarding. And that's just like personal side projects I'm doing. So I team up with biologists and research teams and come alongside them to do photography. I do a lot with remote like camera traps and stuff like that.
Okay.
So photographing behaviors and stuff that maybe we've never actually seen before at all.
Wow.
And so kind of we're adding to the science because we're learning about animal behavior, and then we're also empowering their message and helping them communicate the science to the public, which is a very difficult thing to do. And having visuals that go with that adds a lot of value to them. So I would say my work primarily is divided between those 3 things at this point.
Awesome, Jake. Thanks for breaking it down in that way. That's exactly what I was looking for. It's always fascinating to me to hear how people's business is set up, and I just love the story of how you went with where the market was going and evolving, and taking those photo tours as a great way to enable people. I think you're spot on. People love the ability to get out there, capture it themselves, and you're giving them the place to do that. All right, let's keep talking wildlife. Specifically, let's zone in on your area of specialty, Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, etc. So Africa has its big 5, right? What are the animals of Yellowstone and Grand Tetons that are the coveted ones to photograph? Start us off with that. Okay,
well, bison obviously is one. There's not many places you can photograph them, and they're huge. A big male bison is 2,000 pounds.
Yes.
It's an awe-inspiring experience to sit there with a bison.
Okay.
Sea bear, we have in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's not many places you can find grizzlies. There's only one other ecosystem in the lower 48.
They scare me.
They're not that bad.
Okay.
They're only bad if you scare them.
There you go.
My friend always says that they have a tendency to overreact. So if you scare them, they scare you back. So bison, grizzlies, I would say elk.
Okay.
Moose, number 4. I would say those are the 4, most coveted wildlife stuff.
How about wolves?
And wolves, yeah.
Okay.
Wolves. So that's 5. There's the 5.
Awesome. We kept it with 5. Of those 5, what are the hardest to come by?
Wolves.
Okay.
Wolves, definitely.
All right.
Yeah, and we have mountain lions, a lot of diversity out here. Yeah. Owls, we have great gray owls, great horned owls, we have bald eagles, osprey, red fox, coyote. So there's no shortage of wildlife out here. Yeah.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, take a moment. Tell us a story that comes to mind as, let's just say, one of your most memorable wildlife experiences, whatever you want to make of that.
Oh, that's a tough one. It's also a question I get a lot.
Okay.
And there's just so many of them. But I would say, before I give any specifics, in general, it's those moments where you're far off the road and it's just you and whatever that animal is.
Yeah.
And you have one of those intimate encounters where you're not chasing the animal, but you've set yourself up based off of your knowledge of that animal's behavior, where they're going to show up, and you're just there as part of their environment, and they choose to accept you. And all of a sudden, this whole world is opened up where you're able to witness natural behavior. They're not nervous. They're just doing their thing, and you're just kind of a bystander. So anytime I can get that experience, that's what I thrive on as a wildlife photographer. So anytime I can get that, it's a memorable experience for me.
Yes.
There's been many of them. I love bears, so of course, anytime you get to have kind of an intimate experience with a bear, it's something else. They just have a whole nother level of awareness about them. But I would say a few years ago, I had a particular shot in mind that I wanted of a herd of elk crossing the river with Mount Moran, which is a mountain we have here in the Tetons in the background.
Okay.
And that was another one of those experiences. It took a lot of time, a couple of weeks of sitting in a blind and just waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, one morning, I was sitting in the blind. And, you get there at dark. You can't see anything because the elk are all bedded down. So you have to get there before they wake up.
Okay.
And every day they cross the river, and they go out from the open where they're grazing at night, and then they cross into the timber. And so that's what you're waiting for. But you don't know where they're going to cross. I mean, they may cross in front of you. They may cross behind you. They may cross completely out of sight. And so you just have to kind of get lucky and put the time in. So this particular morning, I was hiking in. I could see the whole herd bedded down. And I crept through the sagebrush, got down to the river bottom, set up my blind, and waited for about 30 minutes. Gorgeous sunrise. And all of a sudden I could hear the elk getting up. And they were walking like, I actually nervous I was going to get stepped on. They were right outside the tent, 2 feet away. And I heard water splashing behind me or to the side, and I only had one opening out looking at the mountain because I didn't want them to detect movement from the inside. And I thought, oh man, this whole shot's blown. I was like 10 feet forward. And just about that time, another group came up on the ridge in front of me, and they all started to cross. But it was probably 15 or 20 cows, and it was a beautiful scene. The mountain, gorgeous clouds in the sky, nice light on the elk. But it was only cows and calves, and you really needed a bull to complete that scene. And just at the last minute, the bull came bugling and ran down and jumped in the line, and so the whole herd just crossed. And it was just one of those moments that a year, and then you dream about them, and that's what fuels you to keep going. You just want more and more of those experiences. They're pretty addicting.
That's awesome. I think I even saw that site won an award. Is that right?
It did, yeah. It sure did. Yep, it was in the Smithsonian, which was quite the honor. Yep.
That's pretty cool. Cool. Congratulations on that. All right, I'm going to stick with the experiences. You mentioned the goal is that experience where you're in nature, you're basically a part of their environment, and they accept you as part of that.
Yeah.
All right, so wildlife, they might not accept you. What do you do? Like, just talk us through that side of it, because you have to be very safe and careful. Just talk us through that side of it.
Well, first off, the most dangerous thing you can do is chase an animal.
Okay.
Which is and I get that because I have the same instinct too. And I think that's probably one of the most common mistakes in wildlife photography. You see something, it's not quite at the right angle, it's not looking at you, and you just pursue it. So we see that in the park all the time, and it gets people into trouble.
Okay.
But you have to understand that from an animal's perspective, the only thing that comes directly toward it wants to kill it, for the most part, right? So it's only going to perceive it as a threat. So as much as you think you can follow an animal around and get good shots, you're only going to get butt shots. We all know that from experience.
Okay.
So, and I kind of touched on this a minute ago, but I like to kind of be proactive with it. So think ahead of time, almost envision the scene that I want in advance. And that takes time. Like the elk, it took 10 days. But if you can put yourself in that situation where you know the animal is going to be, you're just calm. You're setting up. Maybe you're in a blind. If you're with elk or something, a blind works well. With bears, I don't recommend a blind. With predators, I like to go ahead and let them know from a distance, here I am. And then if they decide to come closer, that's their decision, right?
Okay.
Pushing yourself on the wildlife, it never works. You have to put that ball in their court. Let them decide.
Okay.
If they stay 200 yards away and they say, okay, you're there, they smell you, they see you, and then maybe 30 minutes later, they come a little bit closer, that was their decision. And if you're not moving and you're not walking toward them, you're not going to change that environment. They've already accepted you as part of the environment.
That's good.
And it's not really that difficult of a scenario to create. It sounds like it, but it's really just knowledge of wildlife behavior, knowing where they're going to be. Maybe that's a knowledge of food sources. Maybe that's just knowing their daily routines, and then putting yourself in position and just waiting. It just takes a lot of time. But it's really the same dynamic that makes roadside photography a very safe and productive way to do wildlife photography. As much as I spend a lot of time in the backcountry, but if you're just driving around the park, you'll see elk and you'll see bears and bison, and occasionally somebody's hurt by a bison. You really have to work hard to get gored by a bison. I mean, they're not just like out there to gore you. You really have to chase them with an iPhone. But side note,
And that happens, sadly.
my point is, the wildlife that have a home range or a territory that has roads going through it, they know the road's there. So they've kind of accepted the road as part of their environment. And so that's why you can drive right up to a bull elk or a bison and it doesn't freak them out. You walk up to that same animal in the backcountry that was calm on the roadside, they're going to freak. Because you're not part of the environment anymore. The road is something they've accepted. They know it's there. So it's kind of creating that same just feeling of familiarity and comfort. It's their decision. They're in control. And that's where I find I have the most productive wildlife encounters. And you don't want a scared animal. I mean, it's not fun to photograph a terrified animal.
Right.
Around thinking they're about to, it's just not interesting. So I like those shots where the animal's not even looking directly at me all the time. Maybe they're kind of looking off to the side, which shows that they're kind of in their natural state. They're relaxed. They're just doing their thing. So
that's good. Oh, Jake, awesome tips. Catching them in their environment. Keep going with the tips. I love hearing tips. Keep going with the tips. Mostly, let's put it in the lens of an average photographer that's coming to the park, maybe wants to go a little bit further than the roadside. Your tips earlier about creating the environment is awesome. Keep going. Give us some tips for someone that may have a couple days out there just to make sure they get the most out of their time.
Sure. Well, this may sound overly obvious, but people always underestimate how early you need to get out, especially if you're visiting the Tetons or Yellowstone in the summer.
Yeah.
Right now, with days of mid-80s, the wildlife goes to bed.
Okay.
If you're out in the park and you spend 5 to 7, you will have more wildlife encounters than you would have if you did 9 to 5. I will guarantee it. That's
awesome.
really, and not only is the wildlife active, the light is best at that time, honestly.
Yeah.
And so it has a lot to do with temperatures. When it's hot, they're just out in the morning and out in the evening. And another thing I would encourage people to do who are interested in getting into wildlife photography, and especially coming to places like the greater Yellowstone where you have beautiful landscapes, is to not be afraid to use space and include environment in a shot. I think the tendency is to always get face shots. We just want to get as close as we can. And once again, I completely understand that impulse. I have it too. When I see an animal I haven't photographed before, I just want to get as close as I can. Yeah. And there's something said for that. But to be honest, the best wildlife shots are not full frame nostril shots. They're just not. They're shots where maybe the animal takes up just a fraction of the image, but it tells a story. You have mountains in the background. You have fog. You have the dark forest. Anything that includes the environment, it will evoke more emotion from a viewer, and it will tell a story about where the animal lives. And those are much more difficult shots to pull off, and they will take time because it's like a combination of landscape and wildlife. You have to think both ways. Yes. What's about clean and simple, but at the same time is not detracting from your subject. So it takes a lot of practice, and it doesn't work all the time. But I think that's just a common thing I see with people is just always trying to get closer and closer and closer. And people are deterred from getting into wildlife photography because not everybody wants to go out and drop $12,000 on a 600 millimeter lens. Right. So you think, what am I going to do? The reality is my favorite wildlife shots I've ever taken are with my 70 to 300. Awesome. So you don't need huge focal length to get into wildlife photography.
That's huge. I was actually going to ask about gear. What's the nice to have? Sounds like the 600. What's the must have? People that are showing up for your workshops, what do you tell them?
If they ask about renting, sometimes people will rent gear, and I'll tell them, have everything from a wide angle, 17 to 40, mid-range, 70 to 300, somewhere in there. And if you want bigger, that's great. I mean, a 600 millimeter is awesome. And sometimes if an animal's 200 yards away, you really do need that focal length.
Okay.
So if cost is not a factor, then yeah, by all means,
Yep.
get the extra millimeters. I don't shoot more than 600 much. Beyond 600, I find you have atmosphere distortion, and I very rarely like the look of an image beyond that.
Okay.
But once again, sure, there's the 600 millimeters primes that are as much as a car, but both Canon and Nikon in the past couple of years have really made wildlife photography more accessible with some killer lenses. The Canon 100 to 400 is one of my favorite lenses I own. The first one was actually the worst lens I ever owned.
Okay.
It was soft, it's a dust pump. The new one is as sharp as my 600. It's awesome. And the Nikon 2 to 500 is also a killer lens. You lose a stop, but it's still for $1,000, $2,000 you can get in the game and start shooting almost a 600 millimeter equivalent. If you put the 1 to 400 on a 70, you are 600 millimeters equivalent sensor. And that's what I do when I'm hiking often. Okay. I mean, the 600 if I'm scouting. I would like to think that it doesn't bother me and I'll just hike anywhere with it. But the reality is sometimes it's heavy. Yeah, it gives you a backache. So I'll put the 7D on the 100 to 400 and hike around. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, spot on. I actually, for a trip, I'm going to Yellowstone coming up. I did rent I think a Tamron 150 to 600.
Perfect.
It's not a super fast lens, but I thought, hey, for renting it, should be fun.
Yep. No, it's really sharp. My client 2 days ago had that, and when we sat down for our post-process session, I was really impressed with it. So,
okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that. Yep. And it's honestly nice to be able to pull out. So we're talking about including environment in the images. Well, with the 600, I can't tell you how many times I've been so disappointed that I can't zoom out with it. Yeah. It's great until they get too close, and then you are just getting nostril shots. Yeah. And if that's what you great, but I mean, I love including that environment, and so I always have that 100 to 400 on one of my bodies right there, so I can switch to zooming out. So you have that flexibility with the zoom lens that you don't have with the prime.
Cool. Right on. You mentioned briefly post-processing. Any quick, simple post-processing tips you'd give us from a wildlife perspective?
Well, I would say that post-process should be a really fun and significant part of your creative process. Agreed. I think some, for various reasons, like to downplay it. You hear a lot that, we get it right in the camera, we don't need to do post-process, etc. Or other people, I think they're just overwhelmed by it. Like Photoshop sounds so beyond complex. That why would I even want to bring that kind of complexity into something that I want to just enjoy as a hobby? Lightroom is very, very simple. There's easy ways to get into post-process that won't take you all day. It'll take you 5 minutes to do an image. But I would say that it is an essential part of the creative process.
Totally agree.
Everybody should be playing with post-process, and don't overdo it. I mean, if I'm going to give simple advice, that's what you see is cranking up the saturation, cranking up the contrast. We sell these new tools and sliders, and we're like, "Ooh, that looks cool," and then before you know it, it's hideous. So I think the guiding principle for me in post-process is subtlety.
That's good.
So you want everything to be subtle. And I'll spend a lot of time on an image, and I do a lot of work to it. But I don't want somebody to look at it and think HDR or think,
That's right.
just, completely botch that thing. So I want it to have a very subtle impact. My post-process has been influenced primarily by actually looking at paintings. So here in Jackson Hole, we have the Wildlife Museum of Wildlife Art.
Yep.
And it's world-class paintings, wildlife paintings here. It's a really unique experience if you're visiting. It's worth stopping in there. But I've spent days just walking through there and just paying attention to how a painter guides the viewer's eye to the subject in the scene.
That's good.
And you'll notice there's the two primary ways that I see, and then once again, I'm not a painter, so somebody else could probably speak more knowledgeably on this than I can, but what I see is they're using light and they're using detail. So the eye always goes to the brightest part of every scene, and the eye is going to go to the area with the most detail, especially with wildlife. So I actually use that a lot in post-process. And at Lightroom, for example, you can use the little adjustment brush. There's a circular tool called a Radial Filter, where you can just either apply an adjustment inside the circle or outside. And once again, subtlety is the key, but I will take the Radial Filter, for example, draw a circle around my bear, apply the effect inside the circle, so I invert it, and then I'll do a subtle white. I'll pump the whites, maybe 10, plus 10, and maybe add a little bit of clarity in there. And then I'll do one more circle. It's kind of like a vignette effect, but not an obvious vignette. So it's a wider, highly feathered circle. And I'll add a little contrast to increase the appearance of blacks, and then tone the highlights down just a little bit. But it's subtle. So when you look at it, you don't really know what's happening, but the effect is that the viewer all of a sudden is being drawn into the subject in a much more powerfully, in a powerful way that they weren't before. So, I think there's very simple ways to kind of get creative with your post-process without overdoing it. So, yeah.
Jake, that was spot on, man. That was awesome. Because I've noticed that when I looked through your images, I was thinking like the light on the subject, the wildlife, is fantastic. And in the way you're doing it, subtle, 100%, but it really does make a difference.
Thanks.
So thank you.
And there's
awesome tips.
People out there, landscape photographers like Thomas Heaton and Nick Page, two guys you've had on your show before. They're excellent at post-process and photography in general. But there's not as many people doing wildlife and giving that much thought to post-process. So landscape guys have really got it down. And I've actually, a lot of what I do in wildlife images is stuff that I've kind of taken from landscape guys and then improvised and applied in a different way. So, yeah.
That's good. It makes a huge difference. That's why I always try to ask about post-processing, because I think to your point, some people overlook it or don't put as much into it for whatever reason, but it makes a big difference in a subtle way.
It really is worth, and I mentioned it earlier, but emphasizing that it is a fundamental and important part of the creative process. It's not a negative thing.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the line, we started thinking that Photoshop was bad and I don't Photoshop my images. But if you go back to the earliest days of photography, the people that stood out, like Ansel Adams,
100%.
They're not famous because of their photography only. He's famous because of his darkroom techniques.
That's right.
And the darkroom now primarily is on the computer. And that's just always been the way it is. So the images that stand out and stand the test of time are those that have, a significant part of that effect is the result of post-process. So
100%. Oh, awesome. Again, I want to promote your tours. Anyone going to Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, sign up with Jake. Let him take you out. Clearly, great expertise, great storyteller. It will be time well worth it. So, Jake, thanks so much for joining us. Again, check out Jake's tours. Check out his website, his Instagram account. Jake, thanks for joining us. This was absolutely awesome.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.